love seeing a full house, and you just should know how fortunate you are, because I think there are another 100 people out there somewhere that are going to have to see this remotely. But we are thrilled to have you all here. I'm Sherry Gelden, and just couldn't be happier to have reached this day for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that it marks the culmination of a project that is almost 3 years in the making. But before I get to that, I think you all know that tonight the Wexner Center is proud to open 2 exhibitions, both of which feature 2 singular women artists. And while that's not meant exactly as a political statement, it is something of a marker, because I'm very pleased to say that as we look out over calendar year 2017, every single every single exhibition and every single gallery will be occupied this year by women. So. And for those of you who know how exhibition planning happens, you'll know that that isn't necessarily a direct response to anything that might be going on in the world right now, but we're damn pleased that it worked out that way.
Are we correct? Are all the women single?
No, they're all singular. Thank you. So, I should, though, hasten to say that it is not simply by virtue of being a woman, nor by virtue of having been Cuban-born in 1915 and later an immigrant to this country, nor by virtue of actively making art yet today at the young age of 101 years old, that Carmen Herrera deserved a retrospective of the caliber of that organized by the Whitney Museum. Quite simply, the museum, and in particular, their former curator and director of the collection, Dana Miller, recognized that this pioneering and vastly under-recognized artist had never been given her due, despite, in fact, having achieved a body of abstract geometry that was surely a match for some of her much more illustrious peers, Ellsworth Kelly, Frank Stella, and others. So we are thrilled to welcome Dana Miller here today. Dana, where are you? Well, we are thrilled that she's somewhere in Columbus at the moment. I hope she's not outside in the overflow. But in any event, she organized a beautiful exhibition, and I am also pleased to acknowledge that this was the first installation foray of our new senior curator of exhibitions, Michael Goodson, and I hope that you will all agree that the show looks exquisite, and that Carmen Herrera more than holds her own in this crazy, idiosyncratic Peter Eisenman building. And in fact, she once herself said, "I wouldn't paint the way I do if I hadn't gone to architecture school. That's where I learned to think abstractly and to draw like an architect." So it was, in fact, Herrera's deep affinity for architecture that led us to pair this exhibition with that of Sarah Oppenheimer, Wexner Center artist in residence over nearly 3 years now. The fact is, we first approached Sarah on a commission that was meant to be, something somewhat modest. We brought her here. She was clearly so entranced and probably perplexed as well by this building, that you could sort of see the wheels turning in her head, and it became really evident that something simple, something that didn't really take this building on in all of its, shall we say, determination, just wouldn't do. And so that ensued, there ensued many, many visits where she spent hours and hours, not just in the galleries, but poring over drawings. And the fact is, she has come up with something that I have to say, in my 20 plus years here at the Wexner Center, I've never seen anything that is really more conceptually ambitious. And I can't wait for you all to experience it. If I'm really honest, despite many presentations that Sarah made with computer drawings and the like, I'm not sure any of us ever really understood quite what it was we were getting into. But what I do know is that it is a brilliant hybrid of art and architecture and engineering and imagination. And it somehow approaches the phenomena of gravity and motion with a kind of delicacy and dexterity of an incredible choreographer. It's kind of like a ballet in that gallery. And we couldn't have perhaps imagined the impact, but I feel certain that this is going to be one of those shows that forever stays kind of etched in the minds of our visitors. To help us navigate Sarah's quite sort of, I'm going to say, unique way of looking at the world, we were really pleased to enlist architecture theorist and critic Laurent Stalder, who is a professor since 2006 at the very prestigious ETH in Zurich. He has contributed a really beautiful essay to the catalog that will be produced in connection with the show, but because we wanted to include installation photographs, you won't be able to take one home with you today. You can, in fact, order one, and it will be here hopefully late March, early April. And in addition to enlisting Laurent, which we were thrilled to do, this project has also required the collaboration of a lot of folks across the university and across the country, in fact. And rather than take the time now to thank all of them, I simply want to pay my respects and my appreciation to Ohio State's College of Engineering, to the Knowlton School of Architecture, and to a whole host of students and faculty who along the way have aided and abetted this process. Before I call Laurent and Sarah to the stage, I hope you'll just indulge me for a moment as I thank some colleagues, particularly here at the WEX, who have just gone above and beyond, particularly for Sarah's project. We are incredibly fortunate here to have as our Director of Exhibition Administration Megan Kavanaugh, who herself is a proud product of the Knowlton School of Engineering and could not have been a better partner for Sarah in every conceivable way, nor to me. So Megan, thank you so much. I don't want to make anyone uneasy, but let's just say the building had to be reinforced to accommodate this project. And I am hugely grateful to Deputy Director Jack Jackson and to our Director of Facilities, Holly Brubach, for very gracefully accommodating every possible need without at all interfering with what the artist was intending to do. And the crew particularly who oversaw this installation, led by Dave Dickus, including Nick Stoltz and James Miracle, along with a host of other folks, have not had a day off since January 1st. So I hope you will all join me in thanking them for their faithfulness. Let me also just take a moment to thank the National Endowment for the Arts while they still exist, for me to thank them, and Nancy and Dave Gill, who very generously supported Sarah's project as well. And I guess finally, not finally, that sounds too final, just deeply, I would like to express my thanks to Sarah, who has been such an inspiration to so many of us here, and who reminded me over and over again when it's sometimes hard to keep in mind why I really do love this building. And it's Sarah's way of helping you see the world in a kind of from a different perspective and through a different lens. And as I shared with her a few weeks ago, when it was announced that the preeminent critic and thinker and eminence grise, John Berger, had passed away, and of course he's most known for this seminal tract called Ways of Seeing. And as that title echoed in my head, and of course Sarah was laboring in our galleries, I couldn't help but put the two of those things together, because Sarah very much understands that how we view the world affects what we see, and how the specificity of what we see affects our worldview. And with that, I would like to call Laurent and Sarah to the stage. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, wow, it's on. How quick. So I'm going to say a couple remarks before Laurent and I start talking. I was thinking about what it means to have an opening. And I was thinking about how unusual, for me, this particular opening is. And I think what struck me about this particular instance is that I don't really know that I am celebrating the work existing per se. I think what is exciting to me about today is it seems to be a celebration of a kind of belief and the possibility of how a collective belief can lead to the realization of what at certain moments seems totally impossible. And I think that that belief cannot happen alone. You can't imagine something alone and actually, I think, ever realize it fully. I think there's something about a shared imagining that is incredibly important. And so the thanks that I want to give tonight are thanks not solely for specific forms of support, but actually for a much broader degree of belief, which has then ensued or required, I would say, a tremendous effort and contribution creatively and intellectually. And there are very specific people I'd like to thank, and I will actually thank them by name. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the three people sitting in the front row here. Actually, there are four of them, but I'm going to publicly thank three of them. Naomi Maki, Deo Parin, and Levi Murphy, who have worked with me for the past 3 years on this project tirelessly. And I think that this project and all of its forms, all of the images you're seeing, the content, that its materiality, its physical presence, all of that would not have ever come to be without the contributions of these three individuals. And so I am really incredibly indebted to and grateful to all of you. There are then a whole other layer of belief, which I would like to call attention to, which has to do with the Wexner Center and the people at the Wexner Center and the institutional structure of the Wexner Center. So as Sherry had indicated, I have received this residency award, and that was a far greater gift than I ever could have imagined, largely because it's at the outset said we believe in the possibility of a creative act that we don't yet know, the result of which we don't yet understand or know and cannot predict. And that sort of support is extraordinarily rare. And it's extraordinarily rare to have a director of an institution who will put the institution's sort of space and resources online for that kind of belief. And I am incredibly grateful for that. I also think that then the many people at the Wexner who have been involved in this project have been so extraordinarily generous with their time, their intellect, their resources. Megan Kavanagh, who's also in the front row here, has totally changed my life. This person has devoted extraordinary efforts to the realization of this project in ways that I actually can't even imagine, because I'm sure some of those things I'm not even aware of. But I thank you. And I would also like to thank David Dickus, who is leading the crew here, who is an extraordinary person who has put an enormous amount of hours. So there are many, many people involved. The mechanical engineering school, 3 individuals in that school were extraordinarily supportive and involved. Number of fabricators and engineers, the list is long. I won't bore you. But I will say this project is expansive, and I am incredibly grateful to be able to be here to celebrate its realization with you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think the challenge today will be to bring somehow together what you have said, the architectural, the technical, and the artistic, and we are going through a series of slides somehow to try to discuss and perhaps also to discover new things through this talk. Actually, I want to begin with the first topic, the architectural. I think your work is somehow always a comment on architecture and its limits also, the physical limits, but also perhaps their conceptual limits, be it your recent work you did in Luxembourg, where somehow you challenged the grid of Pace Museum, or in other works where you reflected the relation between inside and outside, between physical space and experience space, between the viewer and the institution or the artwork. So to begin with a very simple and general question, how do you approach a commission?
So I think something that has been a primary interest for a long time is looking for the general conditions that one finds in every specific instance of the built environment. So how can we look for, within the vast different, sort of specifically different spaces we inhabit, sameness? And there are several conditions which I think are generally repeat themselves. One of which would be division, meaning there is, in most buildings, a division between the interior and the exterior, whether that's a visual division or a climatic division or an environmental division, is a little bit, uh-oh, I think I've lost this. Is a little bit arbitrary, but I think that division is central to a kind of generic condition, meaning buildings are about creating this limit between spaces. And that limit actually also has a kind of geometric configuration which is relatively standardized. The standardization, I think, is important. It allows for buildings to be constructed within certain code limitation requirements or certain construction requirements. And so when I come to any space and I'm asked to engage with that space, I look at how the space is divided. And increasingly, I've looked at how that space may be divided materially and also immaterially. So what sorts of things happen in a space that are immaterial but allow for a kind of articulation between zones. So this diagram that's up now talks about the possibility of that division and also about how we understand perceptually that division. For example, if you look at, there is no laser pointer here, but the kind of the four spaces on the upper right-hand corner and the lower left-hand corner, if you inhabited those spaces, you would perceive that corner similarly. Because to all presentation purposes, it would be a closed corner. But if you look at the thickness of that corner, of how that is articulated in section, in fact, those conditions would be very, very different, and we would not perceptually register them.
But what is missing here somehow is what you do, that you break always these limits somehow, that you try to show these limits by breaking them, by a window, by a hole, by a switch or whatever.
Yes, I think that I'm interested in creating an awareness of the limit and in heightening the awareness of what is beyond the limit. So, and the limit in this case, we're talking about a kind of division. So yes, that is not evident in this diagram. This is more the condition for which I look when I encounter a location.
So perhaps here for the first time, or for the second time actually, you propose a switch. What is exactly a switch, or what does one want to discover through a switch?
Well, I think increasingly I've been interested in how space, the division of inhabitable space need not be a material thing. It can be generated by temperature, by air, by light conditions. And in fact, I think a stage is very interesting because on the one hand, there is this difference of height where we are occupying one location and you are occupying another. But there's also this critical, at least in the current lighting conditions, black or dark space, which delineates the very back of the room from this very spotlit front of the room. And that dark space is doing as much work, I would argue, as the change in elevation between these lower seats and these upper seats. And I'm interested in how the immaterial, such as gaze, you look at us and we look at you, can transgress that boundary. And the switch speaks about, I'm hopeful, the possibility of flow through this divided space. The switch need not be in an open space, but in this case, what we have is a kind of simple animation, an animated diagram of two sight lines, whereby a relay is created through a set of changeable valves or reflectors.
Like we will have in the switch. And are these limits only perceptual or physical, or are there also political dimension to it that you want to address here, like questioning the institution and the limits of the institution, or the way the institution defines itself through the space you work through somehow?
So that's a great question, because one of the things that someone recently asked me was about the possibility of the anchor condition of the artwork into the building. Like and this is not actually a visual. It's not visible to those people who would simply visit the gallery, although it's very visible to those people who've worked on the piece. That anchor condition creates a kind of friction. And if you think of that friction, I would say that friction it could be seen as a disciplinary friction, but it also could be seen as a political and institutional friction. And that friction, I think, has to do with how code and responsibility are divided. How does the building operate? For example, is a building engineered to support its own load? Is it engineered to support the load of a kind of grafted condition? And I think that's a highly charged political condition. And it's also a very socially embedded one, and it's not a visible one. And I'm extremely interested in it. I will say one more thing about this.
Yeah, sure.
Which is, I think that the division of space is always a political condition. It's not it's not always overtly politicized.
Yes, sure. Yes, and now we come to the installation at the Wexner, because I think it's exactly here somehow you challenge a kind of political dimension of this museum, against which or with which you had to work through, because the Wexner is already somehow a comment on architecture. So your work is a comment on a comment of architecture. And I would very much like to better understand somehow how you challenged this architecture somehow, which wants on the one side to challenge architecture, but on the other side, which controls completely the way you perceive or you walk or you exhibit in this space.
So this building for me was an extraordinary gift, I think. Largely because it was so, as Sherry I think used this term, perplexing. And because it was so hard to understand where you were in relation to anywhere else. And especially that's true when you're in what one might call the back of the house. It's less true in the gallery spaces. And it's very interesting to then juxtapose that experience of disorientation with a drawing, or in the case of this building, which was fascinating, with a rhetorical argument. Because there was a great dissonance between the rhetorical argument and the actual structural,
space.
and the drawings. And so that dissonance became more and more evident to me over time, or at least it became more and more irreconcilable. And it created a set of questions. Does the building actually do what the argument says the building is supposed to do? And I would say definitively not, but actually that's a wonderful problem. Why not? What is failure except something that generates a new thing? And but I would also say that it relies on a set of terms that it masks. The building is as much about hiding its own hand as it is about displaying a rhetorical argument. And I think this piece in particular is interested in revealing that which the building does a tremendous amount of work to conceal. So I can talk about these two slides specifically and related to that.
Yes, perhaps you talk before on these slides, and then we go on and try to figure on which level somehow this showing of the hidden side of the building becomes operative in your work.
Okay, great. So if we go to the slide just prior, for many of you who are familiar, this may be very, very obvious, but there is an argument that the building is based on two grids, one being the grid of Ohio State University, the other being the city of Columbus, and that they are rotated at some relatively unusual angle, which I believe is 12.25 degrees. That might be wrong, but I believe that's correct. And that within that grid, there are a series of lesser, let's say, scalar systems, which have to do with the column distribution and the distance, both the cross-section of the column and also the distance between the columns running through the building. And one of the things you'll notice in this gallery space where the work is located is that there are this kind of staggered column line. And that column line actually runs parallel to the axis of the grid, which is, let's say, the large facade wall and the ramp wall. And if you start drawing grid lines, kind of architectural grid lines through that plan, you'll notice that it seems like you have quite a complex rhythm between these two grid lines. But in fact, it became evident through looking at the drawings and playing with the possibility of how this space could be manipulated, if you could go to the next slide, that actually these columns fell on a very simple grid. And they landed, if you rotated the grid at 45 degrees to the ramp wall, that 45 degree would land center on each of the column lines. And it unified the alleged eccentricity of the space and also spoke precisely to the possibility of that rotation as a kind of underlying system. And I found that to be fascinating. I also found it to be fascinating because in a certain sense it negated this 12.25 what I would call rhetorical twist which is evident by the back wall of the gallery along, let's say, what is the west side of the building.
So let's try now to figure out these two interventions. There are two big interventions to make it very simple. In your works, there is on the one part, and there are two structures, two materials, two temporalities even you introduce into this building. On the one side, you build a new background, which is here in plaster, pillar, ceiling, wall, and then there is a mechanical part, the two shifts in glass and steel, which are rotating. The first intervention, interestingly enough, is pretty the same as the interventions the curators have to do all the time somehow, is to fix the space for the exhibits, like the big wall you built. And in your case, what had to be fixed?
So that's a really fabulous question, I think, and I've been thinking a lot about how you, Laurent, spoke about these two, let's call them acts. The one act is the modification of the site, and the other act is this kind of introduction of this alien condition to the site. And the modification of the site, I think, is deceptive because, as you were just saying, the site is modified all the time. Part of the curatorial, part of the way art spaces are, at least in contemporary museums, constructed is that temporary walls go up and down, and they are modified constantly. So when you enter an exhibition space, you're generally always entering a new type of subdivision. So when I have, in all of these visits prior to now that I have visited the Wexner, I never saw the space or experienced the space in what we might refer to as its original condition. Its original condition was never my original experience. My experience was always of a highly enclosed location, and the only experience of what is referred to as its original state was through photography or the discussions I had with people who inhabited the building at that time, or through the plans of the building, which I would say also don't exactly refer to its original state because of the inaccuracy of the drawing to the as-built. So there were two things that needed modification. One was modifying the, let's say, grafted changes that have happened over the years to this particular location in the gallery spaces. And the second was the modification to what we can refer to as Eisenman's original plan. And I actually want to start, or really just focus on the second part. What was modified was what I hope is a relatively imperceptible, creates a relatively imperceptible shift. So the columns were reorganized, and two of them in particular were reorganized as a 45-degree sort of short wall or massive column structure. And the width of that structure was determined by the diagonal 45-degree axis through the larger of the two column grids. It intersects with a very prominent feature.
Let's try a new location.
Okay.
Thank you.
So it intersects with a very prominent feature of that space, in fact, of that entire space, which we probably don't register because it's not at eye level, which is this very strong vertical plane that runs along, if you go back one slide, along that, or actually, yes, along that dashed line up to this skylight and facade wall. So you can go now forward. And that build out encompasses those two elements in the center, the two columns. You'll also notice, if you go back one slide, that 12.25 degree wall has been entirely eliminated from the gallery. So now that rear space actually is, that rear wall, or the west wall, is actually parallel to the ramp wall, meaning that there is no longer this alleged twist in that location. And I think most importantly, or perhaps it's all important, but also significantly and perhaps least perceptibly, the ramp wall had a slope which progressed parallel to the ascent of the ramp itself. And that now has been leveled out to be a consistent elevation and to be parallel to the ground plane, both in the gallery and in the walkway between the two buildings.
So somehow your intervention are not only correction, but are perhaps more explication or revelation of the existing architecture. Somehow when you bringing a new geometrical order, you underline the existing order. Or if you cut the ramp, somehow you thematize this relation between the exhibition space and the ramp, which had been hidden for a long time. Or if you rectify somehow the back wall, you question also the sculptural dimension of the museum by bringing a kind of absolutely white box back to the museum where it was broken for many years.
Yes, that's interesting. No, I think it's interesting because I think that when we enter that space, it's hard to register where the change lies. And so that what we could call rectifying or altering it shapes and plays with our perception of the location, but doesn't necessarily make itself evident because there is such a strongly perceivable thing in the foreground.
Let's go perhaps now to the other part, the mechanical part, which are these two shifts you introduce. The background somehow works with the traditional architecture, with the traditional cardboard architecture. The foreground, which I call the foreground, these two elements introduce a completely new dimension, that of the movement of architecture. And when I say movement of architecture, I don't speak about the ramp, I don't speak about the movement of person inside the building, but I speak about the shifting elements themselves, like a revolving door, like a window you can open. So somehow bringing the mechanical dimension into architecture. Is this somehow one of the key explanations to this building too, that you also want to not only to reveal somehow the spatial qualities of the building, but somehow also the mechanical parts which belong to our built environment since the last 100 or 150 years?
So, absolutely. And I think that one of the striking things about contending with the less visible aspects of a building, such as how you may anchor something to a building envelope, is that you become intimately aware of the mechanization of the building. You start to understand airflow, you start to understand some of the structural transitions between different load-bearing members, and it creates an understanding of how a building works that's extremely it's very different from the appearance of a space. You start to think about how it's working. And in that sense, the building or the building around us starts to feel like a moving mechanical condition at its core. And I think for me, in playing with that, and this was really the project with the Wexner Center Residency and the School of Engineering and the workshop that happened in the School of Architecture, all were the kind of early stages of starting to think about that as a literalized condition. What would it mean to, and also my many conversations with you over the years around the possibility of the device or the machine, the architectural machine, really became foregrounded in this new work.
And somehow, strangely, when we speak together, you always underline this mechanical, this technical part, which is also shown in this series of mock-ups you did. On the other way, it could be also understood as a minimalist sculpture which has been put in motion. So there are like two aspects of it. One which is easier to argue about, the question of mechanization and the way it has been built. And the other is about which you don't speak often, is the proportion of the shift, the play of the geometries that you play with is that the dimension that is too difficult to address, or it's too critical to address, or it will be too historical to address, or is it a result of a mechanical intention?
Well, I think that's a really wonderful question, and I think it points towards how I see and perhaps want the work to operate. Because I think of, let's say, a sculpture as something that is to, not all sculpture, but many sculptures, to be looked at or walked around. And I think of a doorway as a very different kind of condition. It becomes a memory container, it becomes a political argument, it becomes a linguistic boundary, and I think that for me is a far more engaging framework. And in some ways that is why it's easier for me to talk about it that way. So for example, one of the features of this particular work and also of this particular building that have really resonated with me is that proportionally one could see these as elongated sculptural elements, but you could also then start to understand them as columns and beams. And the possibility of that transition, which I think you pointed out some time ago in my studio, I think really seems incredibly interesting also in terms of how load is distributed and the ideas about how load may be distributed between different systems of construction.
No, I think especially these are the two where a column becomes lintel or lintel becomes a column. And what is interesting, or what interested me in this work about a dancing column or a dancing lintel somehow is that the notion of performance is not anymore limited to the viewer which moves inside the space or engages somehow with the space, but that here the dimension of the performance has a new dimension as the object with which the viewer engage is in movement. And so the object-subject relationship completely changed because you're, like in a revolving door, you have to stop to wait until the revolving door begins to revolve, to enter it. And so suddenly it's not anymore clear who determines the way you are going. And the same is happening here somehow, and we saw it just before in the galleries, somehow how people were suddenly part of the machine. There was even a woman which you had to take apart because she was somehow the machine herself. She became the motor of the machine.
So something very interesting about revolving doors, and I'm trying to recall if this is something that you had written about them, is that when you are in the midst of the rotation, you lose the sense of it as separate from you entirely. And it's also a highly, as this also returns to Sherry's notion of choreography, it's a highly choreographed act, meaning the body moves through a set of registers that are very familiar to us, but also are somewhat uncomfortable. And that action creates a complete collapse of distance. There's no viewing distance whatsoever. There is no contemplation. There is no separateness between you and the device.
Absolutely. And I think this is perhaps where we have also to bring together all the intervention, because we have now been dividing them, but somehow it's always the same topic or the same machinic aspect of architecture you engage in. On the one side, on a very little one, where the thing moves, and on the other one, on a metaphorical one, in the unrevealing of the grid and unrevealing of the new geometry, the introduction also of this invasive microarchitecture inside this building, which is strangely completely hidden here. There's not even a revolving door to enter this building, which surprised me. For an outsider, and I think this is a topic we have to address, which is quite obscure in your work, is the title. So the title of this work is S33 74 73. what is the signification of the title, or what dimension has the title in your work?
So the title is, it derives from a larger typology, which assumes that there is a general condition for every project. And that general condition, to return to the idea of the opening slide, is that space is divided and that there are a series of adjacencies that are set in motion by this process of division. And if we assume that there are, let's say, different zones, the titles refer to flow between the zones. So S, the first digit or the first integer, is a letter. And that letter signifies a kind of more thematic relationship to the work. The letter here is S, and that stands for switch. The numbers following actually refer to the type of flow across that boundary. That flow may be material, such as circulation, the passage of a body, and it may be immaterial, such as light or sight lines across a set of different spaces. And actually the goal, or perhaps goal is the wrong word, but the conceit is that every work could be recreated from its title.
Site unspecific.
Site unspecific. It's a site unspecific title.
So you could have the switch. So you could have this same switch with the same light conditions, and no, it doesn't work because the combination of the letter. And this is, I think, what is more interesting than the exact explanation of the different letter and the different numbers is somehow, I think, that your work is part of a larger experiment you have been doing since many years, where you put together somehow some conditions, and then you challenge the condition in specific spaces. Because on the one side, there is a very site-specific intervention here or in Luxembourg or in Miami or whatever. And on the other side, there is this absolutely unsite-specific, where you really work on a device, on the dimension of a device, and the development of a device from a simple hole up to a beam, a revolving beam or revolving lintel.
Yes, and I actually think that's one of the reasons why this project is so significant and the Wexner is so significant, is that there is the possibility here to have a sustained research into something that can extend past the singular instance. So you can actually investigate or research over a very long period of time in many projects a singular idea.
And which would be?
Which would be the possibility of modulating flow between divided spaces.
So it can be a hole or a switch.
Yes.
Or whatever.
And it has to do with how boundary is created. A hole is a very different condition than a switch.
Yes, but what is interesting with the hole, that actually the hole is absolutely not plastic. And here in this switch, suddenly you bring in a sculptural element in your work, which is quite new, I guess.
Well, it's interesting because it really has to do with what is, let's call, foreground and background. Because in fact, in making a whole, there's a lot of stuff. And that stuff is actually as much a sculptural element as that which is seen as an absence. It's just what becomes the foreground and the background is weighted differently.
Yes. And now we do something for Sherry, who had to assist for many lectures where she didn't understand what you were doing. And you also wanted with me to speak about the technical aspect, the constructional aspect. So not only the space, not only the behavior of people in space, but also about how the hell do you build that, and what were the conditions and the challenges in doing this. And at the end, I hope we will come again somehow to the more artistic dimension. So here we have a section.
So
I will let you speak here, and I will interrupt you when I don't understand, right?
Okay, so let me just take this little device. I will say briefly a few words about these. What we have here is we
We
have
can continue. One is, the next is a bit better detail. Yes.
well, let me actually back up for a moment. What we actually have is two bridges. The two bridges are bridges in the sense that we have a structural connection to the building at the bottom and the top that are bridged by a transparent or an allegedly transparent material, which we call glass. And these two bridges can rotate around a central axis, which is discontinuous. So part of the challenge of developing this was thinking about this discontinuity between the two axes of rotation. And here we have a compression of that void space where the two rotating elements are actually floating across from one another on either side of the image.
And they're held together through the glass.
And the glass is that material that combines or actually connects them, but it doesn't connect them visibly. Also, importantly, you'll notice there's a kind of bearing system that is encased within this steel tube element. And this bearing system, in fact, works something like a joint. It's a space that allows for a tolerance across this axis so that when these two elements do not align with one another, they can then start to deal with irregularity or encompass irregularity.
So what was the initial? So the initial was the switch.
Yes.
And with the switch, you then went to see the engineer.
No.
Okay.
With the switch, I think what happened was I was very interested in doors. And I started to look at how doors rotate generally along a vertical axis. And that vertical axis, in fact, just to perhaps go a little bit further, or maybe not further.
No, we go after.
That vertical axis became a condition of possible eccentricity, meaning that there was no obvious reason for the element to rotate on that vertical axis. It could rotate on any axis. And as that evolved, it became a kind of set of problems to be solved. How might you rotate something, or how might something behave when it rotated on an eccentric axis, and how might specifically an architectural element, in this case I was interested in an IGU or an insulated glass unit, which is generally a glass sandwich that has no exterior frame, but is a kind of environmental control element. And how might that operate and control the interior and exterior space? So the engagement with the engineers was a conversation that started here at OSU during the workshop with the Knowlton School, and then later grew into a conversation that happened with a facade team at Thornton Tomasetti as we developed the kinetic elements and with the structural loading.
You spoke about the door before, and what is striking with your installation somehow is that a lintel becomes a door frame or a window. So somehow is that you had this idea of transforming a vertical element, a column or a lintel, a vertical element, a column or a frame into a lintel. Is that somehow the spatial decisions you had? And with this decision, then you had to find the technical solutions, how to do it? Or was it much more this challenge of can I make eccentricity out of a very traditional element? Because this seems to me a little bit going in one or the other direction.
Well, I was actually, it's wonderful. There's someone here tonight whom I was working with, but I was working on the development of a functional door. And that functional door was fascinating to me because it posed all of these problems of how might a door work and how might a door set up a set of reflected sightlines between spaces that were unexpected. And so in some ways I wasn't interested in eccentricity, but in other ways eccentricity became that which differentiated, that foregrounded a certain kind of object within a mundane a more mundane exhibition space, the kind of white box. And so it became a balance between how much eccentricity was notable and how much wasn't. And I think when it became clear that the 45-degree axis transitioned from a vertical to a horizontal, that was a wonderful reduction of eccentricity, because the axis was eccentric, but the orientation of the object was not. And that became very interesting to me.
And that's where you begin to develop and work with structural engineers or mechanical engineers to do it.
That's correct.
That's the image we had just before. Yes, this one.
Well, this is, yes. When that problem arose, I started to work with the engineers. But this particular image is the cross-section of the work. And the cross-section of the work was a conversation with many engineers over a very extended period of time.
And then after that, you begin to go into the factories also.
Yes, but it wasn't quite so sequential.
Okay.
Because we basically, as these people in the front row know, we were constantly prototyping, and there were problems at every turn. So for example, how you cut a very large tube at a certain angle is it's a very big problem of orientation. So for those of you who are familiar, let's say, with machining, machines have their own XYZ axis. And this object has an eccentric XYZ axis. So how do you set up the machine to register on a new axis? Those became conversations we were having with factories or individual fabricators, in this case, someone named Alex Orlando, as the project evolved. And what their capacity was materially and mechanically actually strongly determined the form of the work. Here we have a cross section of the kinetic element, and this actually speaks to one of the great challenges of this piece, which was the possibility of the work stopping or only traveling 180 degrees. So buried in the poche of the wall is a large hammer that impacts two shock absorbers mounted on either side of the kinetic detail, which absorb the impact of that massively heavy element as it comes to a stop.
And so this was an issue also in the designing of how how fast the switch would turn.
Yes, and actually that's also very interesting, because the speed of the interval,
exactly.
or speed of that rotation was a huge question. Not just a question in terms of a technical question, but it was a question in terms of how would you encounter it? What would that speed be? What would be a slow speed? And it also became very interesting to think about what was the difference between a kind of tactile engagement with something where you could feel the balance or imbalance of an object, you could feel the complexity of a moving object of inertia and its collision with impacting a stopping device. How does that actually become a kind of material or mechanical realization?
And also more transforming something very heavy into something quite smooth, right?
Yes, or something perceptually light.
And how do you do that? How do you approach these things?
Oh, well, as Sandra Meltzer in the audience taught me 2 years ago, I think, I hope I have this right, equilibrium.
So which is actually extremely interesting that you bring in again into this very perceptual world of the installation, the knowledge of the physical handling of things, how you make a door moving smoothly, or how do you do a car that runs properly on the road, and you bring it back somehow into the experienced world of your installation.
Yes, I think it's fascinating. So here we have the two axes of this rotating condition joined to test that, in fact, they are continuous when bridged as a single element.
And now we have here a window in between.
And now we have glass that actually stands in for this large aluminum plate that's sandwiched between the two steel elements. Here we have the two large glass elements. And one thing that became very important, if you go to the next slide, is that the two anchoring points of the glass maintained a very regular distance from one another. And the fabricator, this was a fabricator in Canada named Agnora, developed a jig system to keep the bars that are bolted to the steel frame regularly spaced. And if you go to the next slide, the reason this was so important is because the proximity of the two axes to one another, given the load, created tremendous stress, dynamic stress, as the element turned. And here we have a diagram from Thornton Tomsetti of that stress calculation.
To bring in a French, actually, I think it's my role here. Simondon, the French philosopher of technology, wrote many years ago about the aesthetics of the technical object. And he explained it through the electrical pole, an object where the different interests of a society would come together. So his approach to aesthetic is less in a formal dimension, as its dimension is as a shared experience. He would define the aesthetics as a matter of concern somehow of our daily life. Is that the role that technology has in your work, or is it just tool somehow to propose a sculptural element or a sculptural dimension?
So I've never heard that quote. That's fascinating. I think I've recently been thinking a lot about how the possibility of contemplation of the art object is obsolete. And in fact, the way artworks operate now is changing radically, that this contemplative space is increasingly eroded and also not terribly viable in terms of how objects are encountered. And I think that what you're describing, which is the social space of the machine, is an increasingly dominant experience and is a really exciting idea because it need not be an isolating condition. It could be a condition which creates a kind of social space around the action of the machine. And I think that's got tremendous potential. I haven't thought about that fully. But I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I had the impression it's over your work, not only in the build work, but somehow also in the drawings you propose of your work, which is the last topic I would like to address. So these are experiments of the simple revolving door, one could say. Mm-hmm. So it's around a circle. But somehow here also, we don't see the technical anymore. So it's already a complete transformation through your way you present, again, here your work. So your presentation is not only a presentation through the installation, but somehow it seems also to be a way how you present it through books, through drawings. And if one follows your work, one has the impression that you have a huge interest also for different techniques of representation, from the sections and plans of the earlier projects up to the isovists, this way of representing the vision of a spectator inside a space, up to this new modes of representation which are movies, and which seems to be quite closely linked to your more recent work on revolving elements.
So one thing about these brief videos is these were recorded from effectively studies that happened not as movies, but as basically kinetic rhino models. And what was striking was that, and this largely was, first I think was actually discovered in the Knowlton School workshop, and then later articulated and evolved through Naomi Maki's research in the studio, is that, in fact, when you have a revolving door, you create a, let's say, a trace, a temporal trace through the circle. So the convention of drawing the door swing is actually a convention of a record of time. And that when you change that axis to 45 degrees, but maintain your viewing plane, meaning plan and elevation, you're actually seeing an eccentric section of a cylinder, which creates an ellipse. And that became really fascinating. So what we have here of the top view and the elevation view creates the same trace, or the same elliptical path. And in fact, to return to your question, Laurent, the movie is less indicative than the trace, because the trace shows the full extent of the path, whereas the movie shows that cross-section only at a given time. And that full path, that full path, for example, is precisely the tool that we used internally in the studio to prevent the element upstairs from smashing into the ramp or smashing into the wall, because here you can see the absolute extent of the corner of the box at every point in its arc of motion.
Yes, I understand the trace as a way of calculating it somehow, but at the end it's a movie which represents it. It's
Yes.
only possible to represent it in a movie to a larger public.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point. And I don't know how that time will resonate as a form of representation in the work.
And especially in books.
And especially in books.
And so I have to stick to time. That's probably also the reason why they invited a Swiss. What is the next step? After the holes, after the shifts, what next somehow? What is your challenge? How are you going to challenge architecture in the next step?
So I'm very excited about a kind of fluid relationship between the column and the beam, or the lintel and the column. And I think that when in our last conversation in New York, I think that possibility of an interdependency, the interdependency of structural system, and it's an evolving condition. We'll see.
So let's the work speak, and I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.